now we request Mr. Shashi Verma to please address the audience. Are we audible, Mr. Verma?
Yes, you are audible. Let me just start my video as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us.
There we go. Okay. I hope you can see me and hear me now.
Yeah, you're visible to us and we all can see you.
Very good. Very good. All right. Well, thank you very much. And good afternoon, everybody in India. I've been asked to speak for a little while about what we're doing with e-mobility in the UK. So let me just give you kind of our experience of what's going on here. Just to introduce yourself to our organization and what we do. So I work for Transport for London. I've worked here for nearly 20 years, right from the very beginning of the establishment of Transport for London. Many of you may be familiar with what Transport for London is and what we do. But if you're not, then let me just tell you a few things about us. So we are the integrated transport body for London. We run pretty much all the transport that exists in London. In fact, in that respect, we are one of the most integrated transport bodies anywhere in the world. Not only do we run the public transport system, including the tube and the buses, the light rail systems and so on, but we're also responsible for managing the road network and the traffic on the road network, including managing all the traffic lights. So in that respect, it really is a form of integration that is much higher than anything that you see elsewhere in the world. Just focusing a little bit on the topic for today, so we have been working on zero emission mobility for a very long time. I'll give you our experience on that one. But the pace and the urgency of everything that we are doing has been accelerated as a result of the climate change crisis and many other factors of that kind. We have a very large fleet of buses ourselves. We run about 9,000 buses in London. About 3/4 of them are double deckers. So effectively, we run a fleet of effective capacity of about 15 or 16,000 buses. It's a very, very large fleet. The only places where you'll find a fleet bigger than this in any one city are all in Latin America. And now, of course, in China. But, a very large fleet. We have a long heritage of running these buses as well. But in addition to that, like any transport organization, and this is sometimes forgotten, we have a fleet of other vehicles, maintenance vehicles, supply vehicles, and so on, that are also in need of the same kind of migration into zero emissions as our diesel buses. But in addition to that, there is the responsibility for making the entire city zero emission, which is sometimes forgotten if you're focusing only on the public transport network. And because we have this integrated responsibility for all of London, we look at what we need to do to get to that kind of zero emission across all vehicles in London, not just the ones that we own. But if I draw the experience back to many, many years, if you go back to the 1980s and 1990s, one of the concerns was about emissions from diesel buses. Back in the 1990s, we introduced low emission, sort of low sulfur diesel. Those were the kind of things that were happening back then. What was called clean diesel back in the 1980s and 1990s. That was a big revolution that came back then, and it did have a big impact. And then in the early 2000s, there was a focus on climate change. And as a result, we started working on both electric buses and, at that time, hydrogen buses. In fact, the first hydrogen bus in London ran in 2005, and they're still on the road. They were a small fleet of single-deck hydrogen buses, fuel cell buses that have been on the road for about 16 years now. In addition to the single-deck buses, we now also have double-deck hydrogen buses that were introduced only earlier this year. And that is a fairly significant thing because these double-decker buses are quite heavy. But then, from about 2009 onwards, the focus kind of reduced on climate change and went more into air quality. And air quality really became the key focus of the environmental concerns in London. Now, this may sound like a bit of an odd statement that we are worried about air quality in London. When you compare our air quality with any city in India, we live in a very clean environment. But the fact is that the aspirations are much higher for having much cleaner air. If you look at the air quality index, you can go and look this up online. There are websites that give you air quality indices from across the entire world on a very comparable basis. Typically on an average day, London's air quality index is about 40. That's 40 sort of micrograms per cubic meter, roughly speaking, of various kind of pollutants. It's an index rather than a distinct measure. The standard in the UK is for air quality the air quality index to be under 25. And we breach that under 20, that limit quite often. But a very bad day in London where air quality warnings are issued is at about 100. Whereas if you look at most cities in India, it's very rare for the air quality index to be below 100. If you look at Delhi in particular, the air quality index is very rarely below 200 or 300. A bad day is kind of above 400. And when we get the pollution episodes in Delhi, typically in November, as we all know, the air quality index exceeds 1,000. So that's the kind of difference that we're talking about. But the business of reducing the air pollutants from an AQI of 25 or 50 or 100 to under 25 has been the mainstay of our policy making for the last decade and a bit. So in 2008, we introduced something called the low emission zone. And then in 2017, we introduced the ultra low emission zone in central London. And that ultra low emission zone is now being expanded to a much wider area of London just next month. And essentially, it requires vehicles to pass a standard for pollution that is much, much stricter. It's basically Euro 6 compliant vehicles only. Much stricter than anything that has gone on before. And the introduction of the ultra low emission zone back in 2017 really, it has had a measurable impact. So these things are really tough policies, but they do work. So that's been the focus for a long time. The pace is being picked up on the climate change challenge again, and as a result of that, in the last 5 years, we have started introducing electric buses, and starting with very simple routes. And I'll explain in a minute why this route definition is so essential. But starting with very simple routes where we started introducing initially single deck buses, we have now gone on to introducing electric buses on more and more routes. And only yesterday, there was a big bus forum in the UK yesterday where the Mayor of London made an announcement of our new policy on electric mobility or zero emission mobility, where there are some key factors, there are some key commitments that have been made. So it's worth recounting what those commitments are. So the first is that by the end of next year, 10% of our bus fleet will be zero emission. So 900 out of 9,000 buses will be zero emission. The second is that we will not be buying any vehicles from this point on that are not zero emission. And that, I think, is a very tough commitment that we've made, because the whole market for double-decker buses in terms of electric or hydrogen mobility is still very, very constrained. But the commitment has now been made that we will not be buying any vehicles with tailpipe emissions. So that's a very strong commitment. And the third commitment is that by 2034, the entire fleet will be zero emission. So all diesel buses will have been retired by 2034. And it's important to understand that that kind of time horizon has to be given, because the whole issue of stranded assets and writing off productive capital assets is actually quite a big deal. So you do have to take into account the life cycle of the capital assets when making commitments of this kind. Earlier, our commitment was to go to zero emission by 2037. The announcement yesterday by the Mayor advances that date to 2034. So that's essentially the path that we are on. A lot of our focus is on electric mobility. That's where the market has been advancing the furthest, and the advances have been more promising. We have been, as I said, investing in hydrogen mobility as well. With the first investments being made in 2005, and now double-decker buses being introduced earlier this year. And we will carry on investing in hydrogen mobility. It looks like the pace is picking up on hydrogen, but at this present point, hydrogen remains not very competitive compared to electric mobility. Now, one of the reasons for us to invest in hydrogen is that, especially when you look at double-decker buses and the weight of the buses, then the whole question of the weight of the battery that's required to run a bus that heavy becomes a big issue. And that's where hydrogen fuel cell may have a competitive advantage over electric mobility. Now, having run electric buses now for about 5 years, there's a number of things that we've learned. For anyone who's running a fleet of diesel buses, I have to tell you that running electric buses is a very different exercise. It requires you to think, and it has required us to think very carefully about the entire value chain of the bus system, the whole logistics of how the buses are organized, where they're parked overnight, how they're refueled, and so on. One of the great beauties of diesel is that it takes only a few minutes to refuel the bus. That advantage does not exist with electric. You do have to allow for time for buses to be recharged. That time becomes a big constraint in the whole operation of buses. With diesel, the energy density of diesel is so high that buses carry usually much more diesel than they need to be able to run a route. In fact, if you look at our buses, there are some that leave a garage, with a full tank, and they don't come back for 3 days. And they're doing sort of 3 days worth of routes before they come back to a garage to be cleaned and refueled and so on again. That is simply not possible with electric buses. So our experience on this was that we first started by picking routes where but there was a very high intensity of demand in the peak periods, but very low demand in off-peak periods. And that basically meant that buses were returning to the garage even between the morning and the evening peak. So in the daytime, buses were returning to the garage, and therefore the time that they had to do, or the distance that they had to do on any one run, was quite short. And that meant that you could equip the buses with relatively lightweight batteries in the expectation that they would come back to the garage relatively frequently. And so there were 2 routes run out of one bus garage. If you've been to London, there's a bus garage right next to Waterloo Station. Waterloo bus garage is where we first equipped buses to run on electric. But as you start looking at other routes, the problem starts getting more and more complicated. So think of routes where buses don't have the luxury of coming back to the garage in between the morning and afternoon peak. Routes where the buses are on the road at least for 12, 14, 15 hours a day. They may come back in the night. So if you've got to have a bus out there for 15 hours, you need to have a battery that can run for 15 hours. There are routes that run 24 hours, in which case the problem becomes more complicated. And the whole scheduling of buses becomes very different because buses will have to come back to the garage at some point, even if it's 24-hour route. So the whole question of how you recycle buses in between trips becomes a very big logistical issue. Then you start looking at buses that are going up and down sort of hilly terrain. London is not particularly hilly, but we do have some hills. And the whole question of how the battery charge gets used becomes very different. So the point I'm making is that when you start thinking of electric mobility, it's a mistake to think of these as a direct replacement for diesel buses. You have to be very careful in acquiring buses with a specification that is fit for the routes that they're supposed to be running. There is no point in buying a generic bus with a much heavier battery than you need, because lugging around that battery is very energy intensive as well. And so this kind of matching of the battery capacity, the bus type with the route becomes a more complicated problem once you're running with electric mobility. It's not an impossible problem by any means, but it is definitely more complicated. And I would urge anyone thinking about electric mobility to think very carefully about this problem, because generic solutions are incredibly expensive in this regard. The second thing that's important is that electric buses are still relatively new. The technology is still evolving. The whole question of how these buses get maintained and who maintains them and so on, I think are very different from the way that diesel and traditional buses have been run. The general experience of diesel buses is that you get your own maintainers, you have your own garages, you maintain the buses yourself. Anything apart from heavy overhaul of the buses is done directly by staff hired by you. That may not be the case with electric mobility, because these buses are more sophisticated. They require less maintenance, but when they need maintenance, it may be better to be contracting with the original equipment manufacturer themselves. So, there are a few lessons to be learned in that regard about how to incorporate these buses. There are other challenges as well, and this, I suspect the other sessions today have touched upon this quite intensively. But let me touch upon it very briefly here, which is that there is a whole ecosystem for diesel, the supply of diesel, and so on. Electric is different. The whole question of how you connect to the grid, the question of how the grid supplies to you, the question of what demand you're placing on the grid and at what times and so on, also start to become critical. So the whole partnership that's needed between the electric utility and the transport system becomes very important. In our case, we call that, we're making investments in what we call grid to gate, which is bridging that gap between the national grid here and the electric, the charging infrastructure in the bus garages. And in nearly, well, in all cases, not nearly, in fact, in all cases, we've had to strengthen that last mile connectivity between the grid and the garage. And that investment is not cheap. It also has to be done very carefully because it's easy to underinvest and then find that your bus system is constrained. It's also easy to overinvest and find that the assets that are there are not being utilized to their full efficiency. And that is a real problem because investment is not cheap in this area at all. One of the big things that we're working on is this question of opportunity charging. That's one way in which the size of the battery can be relieved. So this is where a bus is out on a route, but there might be bus stops along the way, or certainly the terminus point at the end, where the bus stops for a long enough period that there can be some top-up charging that can be provided to the bus. And this is one way of trying to reduce the battery size. In modeling and in experimentation, it's been shown that that's very effective, and in fact, very, very effective in reducing the battery size. But this is another constraint that you're adding to the operation of the buses. So, for example, if you expect a bus to be stopping at a bus stop for 2 minutes and you expect 2 minutes of opportunity charging, and on a particular day, there are not enough passengers at that bus stop to warrant a 2-minute stop, you might still need to stop there even with no passengers there. And that's a real constraint that you're adding to the operation of the buses. And likewise at terminus points, in all of our routes, we have some dead time allowed at the terminus, but that's usually allowed for the route to catch up because traffic is not within our control. So if we now say that time that's being allowed is not just for catch up on the timetable, but also for charging, then it's not really catch up time. That has to be something that's built into the timetable, and it adds another real constraint into the transport network. As I mentioned, hydrogen fuel cell is something that is quite big for us, especially with double-decker buses. And we do hope that industry carries on progressing. And so, that's basically what we're working on. I'll finish on just one point. I'll actually finish on 2 points. The first is that although this world of zero emission mobility looks very distant, we have to remember that at the point at which this technology becomes cost competitive, and it is, it's cost competitive in some settings right now, but not in all settings. But at the point at which it becomes cost competitive in all settings, expect a change to happen very rapidly. This is what we've seen with previous changes. In fact, I could have shown you, I'm not doing a presentation today with the slides, but I could have shown you pictures of Piccadilly Circus just 10 years apart. In 1900, a picture of Piccadilly Circus shows only horse-drawn buses, horse-drawn vehicles. And just 10 years later, in 1910, there are no horse-drawn vehicles. The entire thing has been moved to internal combustion. And that kind of change of economics of the transport network leads to very rapid change. And I think we can expect the same thing to be happening with zero emission mobility here. So be prepared for the fact that that this change can happen very rapidly. So that was one of my 2 final points. But the final point that I want to make, and I think it's essential to make it because it may sound jarring with the idea of e-mobility, but it's really important to make this point. If there is ever a conflict between having buses and electric buses, and I know I'm posing a hypothetical situation here, but if there is ever a conflict between having buses and electric buses, I would always choose to have more buses. Because what you can do to a city's mobility and to its air quality and to climate change and everything else is help much more by just moving from private vehicles to even a polluting diesel bus. Going from a polluting diesel bus to an electric bus or a zero emission vehicle is fantastic news. But the key thing that's needed in India is more supply of public transport. India is a country with a very inadequate system of public transport. Even in the cities that have the best public transport network, including Bangalore, the provision of public transport is really, really inadequate. And therefore, I am posing this hypothetical issue here, but I think it's more than hypothetical. It becomes real when you start thinking of capital investment that's needed here on the supply chain capability to provide zero emission buses. If there is ever a constraint, if there's ever a choice between choosing a bus, which may be affordable, or choosing an electric bus that may not be affordable, I would always choose a bus and expand the public transport capacity, because these buses have a 10 or 15 year life cycle. You will have the opportunity to come and replace them with electric buses as well. But it's much more important to expand, in my view, the capacity of the public transport network than to focus on zero emission mobility alone. So that would be my final point. That's the big lesson that we've learned from London as well. Having the capacity is really important. It contributes to the same objectives around climate change and air quality as having zero emission vehicles does. And that is the reason it's important. It's not just because I'm making a sort of parochial point here. Thank you very much. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take them for a few minutes. Back to you, Reggie.
Sorry, I don't know whether you could hear me or not. Last week, we read that UK government taken a decision that all future buildings, including residential buildings, need to have EV charging point. It's going to be made mandatory. So we just explain about that and how it's going to be implemented.
Well, I mean, it's a very tough challenge, Reggie, as you know. So we are putting up EV charging points all across London as well. But it's happening nationally. But new buildings will need to come with electric vehicle charging points. That's a very major commitment. One of the challenges with the adoption of electric vehicles in a city like London, it's private vehicles is what I'm talking about, is that most vehicles are parked on the street. My own car is parked on the street. Very few people have garages in a big city like London. And so cars are parked on the street. So the whole question of the charging infrastructure becomes really important. We have been investing in electric vehicle charging points ourselves. There are many electric vehicle charging points that we've put on the street network. But the point that's being made now is that where new buildings are being built with off-street parking, or even if there is no off-street parking, but there is the ability to connect an on-street sort of point of charging, then those properties have to come with electric vehicle charging points. And this is to enable the adoption of a higher quantity of electric vehicles. These are private cars that we're talking about, not public transport vehicles. But it's really a sort of catch-22 situation that has to be broken in terms of how the adoption can be improved. And one of the big challenges there is the charging infrastructure. And therefore, the decision that's been made is very, very intense, actually. I think it will help.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience, please? Please give the mic there. Please identify yourself and ask the question to Mr. Verma.
Yes, sound coming. Good afternoon. I'm Karthik. I'm one of the co-founders of a charge point. We are a charge point operator by the name Xeon Charging. So my question here is, see, across the world, governments at various levels, starting from the national governments to the municipal governments, are deploying a lot of capital to offset emissions, to electrify all kinds of vehicles. So since we are talking about taxpayer money here, will you say that in terms of the bang for the buck that you get in terms of the subsidies or the government spending, will it be a good choice to electrify the bus fleets or the public transport fleets, which is in most cases owned by the governments, rather than applying the same money to give subsidies to private vehicles, wherein the utilization rate may not be as high as a bus? So I'm just talking about the not just the number of vehicles, but the electric miles traveled. So would you agree with that? And apart from that, I have another question. So can you just give us a number about the electrification of the London bus fleet, and how much diesel have you offset by doing that so far, or in the last couple of years or the last year? Thank you.
Right. To address your first question first, I think it's a statement of the obvious that what we're trying to offset is not the number of vehicles, but the number of vehicle kilometers. I mean, you know, if the objective is to try and tackle carbon emissions, then carbon emissions are more directly correlated with the number of kilometers done than with the number of vehicles. And if you look at where the most intensive use of vehicles is made, then that's very clearly in public transport vehicles or commercial vehicles. You know, private vehicles actually do relatively little by way of kilometers. You know, my car, I do have a car, I've had it for 12 years now. In 12 years, my car has done 40,000 kilometers. Right? 40,000 kilometers is what one of our buses would do probably in 3 or 4 months. So, you know, that's the kind of difference. And therefore, if you're really focused on how to offset carbon, how to reduce carbon, then you should go after the vehicles that have the most intensive use, public transport vehicles being one. But there are others, you know, there are taxis, there are delivery vehicles that are doing a lot of mileage every day. And it's better to focus on vehicles of that kind than to focus on private vehicles. Now, having said that, there's no harm in focusing on everything. There's no harm in getting private vehicles to become electric as well, because part of it is also about raising the public consciousness that this is an objective that everybody has to take part in. Right? So, you know, we should not ignore that the public commitment and public buy-in is also important. But if you're looking at this purely numerically, then you go after public transport vehicles first. In terms of the quantity of diesel, I don't have the sort of liters of diesel that you're talking about, but about 6 or 7% of our fleet is now electric, and it's progressively going up by about 3% every year or thereabouts. So you can sort of work backwards from there as to how much diesel has been taken off, but it's very, very substantial.
Thank you. More questions?
Hi, this is Roshan. I just had a question on the downtime that electric vehicle has as compared to diesel. One is that. And second, on creating the infrastructure for the public, for the electric buses, what were kind of challenges? Because as sir was mentioning, they had installed something in the Pune and Calcutta depot, and which was giving them a lot of 2000 parameters in how it was actually being used. So I just wanted to understand more from the London experiment.
Well, I mean, in terms of infrastructure, I mean, that's what I mentioned as the grid-to-gate problem. So the real challenge is, I mean, the charging infrastructure itself is pretty standardized now, right? If you're getting the charging infrastructure wrong, then something is fundamentally wrong with the design of the system. Charge points are pretty standardized. There's no complication in that. The critical bit is that gap between the grid and the garage gate. That's where substations need to be set up, and each one of them is bespoke. Having said that, our experience of that is that it takes a bit of investment, but it's not particularly complicated work. It may get complicated because you need to find space in very constrained environments, but it's not very complicated work at all. So, our experience of this is that if you allow sufficient time and sufficient planning, all of these things are possible. The planning is really important. As we know, that in India, sometimes there's a rush to get things done without sufficient planning, and especially sufficient planning about how that infrastructure is going to get utilized. So, it's important to be clear about that from the first day. In terms of downtime, downtime is very much a function of how the buses are being utilized. We're typically, equipping garages with both fast charging and slow charging, but to maintain battery life, it's usually better to do slow charging rather than fast charging. If you do slow charging, then you have to allow for anything between 3 and 6 hours for a bus to get up to full charge. Now, that's usually not a problem because most of our buses do return to the bus depots overnight for a long enough period for 3 to 6 hours of charging to happen. But it does, as I said earlier, it puts a new constraint in the way buses are planned compared to a refueling cycle of just under 5 minutes. So that's got to be kept in mind. It's also important, this is I'm getting into the real nitty-gritty of things here. But with diesel buses, we have very constrained garages, by the way. If you look at our garages, they're tiny and they're packed with buses. I mean, the space that's left between buses is usually less than 10 inches, 25 centimeters. That's how tightly they're packed. With diesel buses, it doesn't matter in which sequence buses come into the garage and in which sequence they leave, because frankly, they're all refilled in 5 minutes anyway. But with electric buses, the sequence in which they come in and go out starts to become important. And the whole design of the garage, the whole sequence in which buses are parked and everything else becomes a real logistical issue. I'm only saying this because, for those of you who are really in the business of bus planning and running depots and so on, you will find that these are new issues that you have to deal with that were not an issue when you were dealing with diesel buses.
More questions? Mike here, please.
Hi, this is Madan. Is there any thought process to reduce the size of the city buses, which occupies lesser space per person, and reduce the size of the battery to reduce the burden on the grid of charging?
Actually, if we could have our way, we would have much bigger buses than we do right now. Right? Remember that at the end of the day, that the biggest operating cost for buses, I mean, in our case, well, in every case, the biggest operating cost for buses is the cost of the driver or the cost of the staff. In our case, 50% of the operating cost of buses is the cost of the driver. Now, you still need a driver, whether you have a 9-meter bus or a 12-meter bus or a 14-meter bus or a single decker or a double decker, it's exactly the same cost. Therefore, the incentive is always to drive the biggest bus that we can drive. And that's why we drive double-decker buses pretty much everywhere. The only places where we have single-decker buses are where, because of physical constraints, we can't drive a double-decker bus. For example, places where there is a low bridge and we can't take a double-decker bus. But, I personally do not understand this obsession with smaller vehicles in India. Road space, the road space taken by a larger bus is only marginally bigger than a smaller bus. But the cost of operation is not that much higher. And if I was running the bus service in India, I would be going for bigger buses everywhere.
Can generate more employment as well as reduce the burden of charging the bigger vehicle, bigger batteries at a given time.
Well, I mean, you can keep generating employment, but the entire bus network runs at a loss. So the reason the bus network is small and there's inadequate provision of bus services is that it's very subsidy hungry. So employment generation is a fantastic aspiration, but not at the cost of not having a public transport network, which is the problem that we have in India right now.
Any other questions? Okay, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much. And sorry to disturb you on a Saturday morning in London. So kind of you to have agreed and stayed back, although we were running late, and look forward to seeing you in India soon again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Reggie. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. So next session is on business models for electric buses and three-wheelers, business models for EV fleet operations, business models for EV charging stations, battery leasing and swapping model for EVs, etc. So more about operationalization of electric mobility is what we're going to discuss. And this session will be moderated by my colleague Reena Suri. And we have 5 speakers here. Nishant Arya, who is Vice Chairman of JBM Group. JBM Group is a very diversified, large manufacturing company, making vehicle parts in different countries. Started with obviously Maruti, and they ventured into electric mobility. They make buses, electric buses. And every day I see in Delhi street at least half a dozen JBM buses going in different routes. Nishant, are you there on WebEx already? Eh? No, I will invite you. I'll invite you. Okay. So with that, I hand over to Reena, but I like to make that seating arrangement slightly different. Give us 2-3 minutes. Can you help?
Now we made the name. They can see. Yeah.
Yeah, hi Reggie, I'm there. Yes.
Oh.
Thank you so much, sir. And with that, we start with our next session, talking about the business models, applicable business models for India for electric vehicle rollouts. So which business model successfully compete in the electric mobility market? There are high initial costs of for electric vehicle and a slow adoption in the mass market, which may result in many companies as a barrier in the entry. And in the commercial mobility market, the key challenge boils down to the economics and the total cost of ownership. Now, with the prices of buses and the vehicles being a little, more than the conventional vehicles, we have to look at the right business models that make commercial sense for the fleet operators as well as the private vehicle owners. And cooperation between the government, the prosumer, citizens, and businesses is the key for the success of the e-mobility in India. The new business models are needed to describe what value is offered to which customer segment and how this value is created and what cost structure and revenue streams are involved. So with that brief introduction, I would like to start our third session for the day on electric mobility business models. As mentioned already, we'll be covering the business models for electric buses and three-wheelers, business models for EV fleet operators, business models for EV charging stations, and battery leasing and swapping models for EVs. We have a fine list of panelists with us today. Before two of our panelists have joined us online on WebEx, and we have 3 more panelists who will be joining us physically in person here on the stage. I would like to invite, first of all, Mr. N. Mohan. He is the head EVCI from Convergence Energy Services Limited. Please put your hands together for Mr. Mohan. Thank you so much, Mr. Mohan, for joining us today here. We have Mr. Nishant Arya, Vice Chairman IBM, JBM, joining us on WebEx. Please welcome Mr. Arya. So I'd like to invite on stage Mr. Swapnil Jain. He's the co-founder for Arthur Energy. Hi, sir, Swapnil. Yeah, please welcome him. I would like to welcome Ms. Prabjot Kaur, co-founder Asmito Solutions. She's joined us on WebEx.
Hello, thank you.
Hi, Prabjot. Welcome.
Thank you.
And lastly, we have Mr. BC Datta, Vice President, Ola Mobility. He's also joining us on WebEx. So we will have him soon with us on WebEx. So We'd like to start, give the stage over to Mr. Nishant Arya from JBM e-mobility, JBM, to talk about the JBM e-mobility ecosystem. What are the different solutions you're bringing? What kind of electric bus deployments you have undertaken in India? With that,
Sure.
sorry, we have a wrong slide here, Sneha. Sorry, just one second. Let me just quickly introduce you, Nishant. Just give me a second. Apologies for the delay. It's not coming. So that's not the right slide. Mr. Nishant Arya. No, the bio. Okay, I think I would request Nishant Arya to please give a brief introduction and start. Sorry about this delay and glitch here. So over to you, Nishant.
Yeah, I'll just share my presentation, Reena, one second. Yeah, is my screen visible? Hello?
Yes, it's visible.
Yeah, okay.
But we can't see your, yeah, we can see your presentation. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So, a very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think it's a very opportune time at which this particular conference has been organized when we are at the cusp of really taking off from here. And definitely we see multiple opportunities in different cities. And Bangalore, I think, is spearheading such innovations and transitions into new technologies for which it has been known first from IT and software, now into green mobility, which is being driven by electric mobility. And at JBM, we embrace such changes, being one of the early adopters and pioneers in the e-mobility and e-bus space. So I'll just talk about our experience and how do we see the industry and what is the perspective and why we are talking about EV here today. So if we see that climate change is impacting all of us across the world, and there has been a huge impact in India and different parts of the world, and 14 out of the top 20 cities in the world are in India, most polluted cities, where we are having extremely high levels of PM 2.5 and PM 10. And it is really seeing that transport is one of the largest contributors to this pollution. And therefore, it becomes our responsibility that how we can address these issues. And definitely, it's an opportunity as well that as we are augmenting, because in our country, the fleet size to the population variance is very high. So we are less than one bus per 1,000 people. So at the same time, we see that different modes of transportation can be enhanced, and we can go straight away with the new technologies for doing so. And for that to happen, there are multiple things which are happening because we have a very high level of urbanization in our country. Multiple greenfield and brownfield cities are coming up across the country, and there's so many areas where things can be done in a very optimal manner, and we can really see that cities can be very well planned, and the urbanization can be green urbanization where new mobility business models can be deployed from day one. So keeping this in mind, we clearly saw that how government of India launched FAME, and in FAME there were different kinds of segments which were given priority, and the highest allocation was given for electric buses, then three-wheelers, two-wheelers, which are the primary stakeholders of the e-vehicle transition, at least for the first few years until we hit parity. And that's where the maximum asset utilization there is there. So therefore, I think this gave us the right momentum to move forward. Then when we look at fame to targets versus achievement, so highest interest from different cities came up in the e-bus area. And definitely out of the 7,190 buses, they had interest from almost 6,690 buses which were allocated to different cities. So highest allocation was done, and that clearly showed that what kind of opportunities lie in this space and how things can be done in a very rightful manner as we move forward. And now with the automotive PLI coming in, I see that which has been announced lately for electric, and a large part of this would be coming to electric vehicles and new energy vehicles, which we see, and not only for the OEMs but for the whole supply chain. So it will be an integrated model where different companies, whether domestic or international, can participate in this, and it will give the right booster which was required for companies to really invest and reap these benefits and see that how we can really contribute to sustainability in the environment. Then seeing that today, what is the kind of growth potential we are talking about in different segments, where we see that in all the segments today, we are almost less than 1% of the total population in the country. But what do we see in the next 4 to 5 years? And if I look at a realistic scenario or an optimistic scenario, I think the numbers speak for themselves. Whether we talk about two-wheelers going from 8 to 15%, or three-wheelers 30 to 35%, or buses 30 to 40%, or cars 3% to 8%, from the optimistic scenario. I think this brings about a huge change in the way of life and the way people were operating, and clearly showcases that what can be done if companies are keen to do it at this juncture. And that is where technology will be driving value. That is the biggest input here. So, but I will talk more about e-buses. So why we talk about e-buses? You saw highest allocation in FAME 2 has been given to e-buses. The highest interest came in that area where maximum vehicles were allocated. And we were just hearing Mr. Verma talk about how Transport of London and different areas, they have challenges with diesel vehicles, hybrid vehicles, and how the transition had to be integrated with respect to the infrastructure, proper planning, routes, and everything. So that's why we say that the ideal conditions and difficult conditions, where road conditions, traffic conditions, all those things. So that's why India falls in the difficult conditions category as on today, where the energy efficiency is also very important. And definitely we have to understand what is the energy per kilometer, and when we compare it with the different fossil fuel or hybrid vehicles as well. If we just see dispassionately, other than just seeing electric buses, one bus is able to knock off a large amount of pollution, and clearly the road space which is required is very limited in this case. So 5 square feet per person vis-a-vis 50 is almost 10 times, and the pollution level is almost 40 times in this scenario. Today as well, in our country, we have a huge issue with respect to parking. In buses, we have depots, we have terminals, so they have fixed parking. The interest rates are similar, and definitely road entry is there, which is a challenge. But since it is not the last mile connectivity, but it is for the longer hauls or within city travel, so this makes a huge change. But clearly we have to see that when we compare all such vehicles, where we talk about the parity with ICE, or we talk about range concerns or charging infrastructure or total cost of ownership, today the areas in electric buses, or we see in three-wheelers, the kind of parity with ICE is very high. Now, if we look at the operating cost, we are much cheaper in electric buses with respect to operating cost. Range concerns are more or less addressed if we talk about city transportation today, and definitely I see that in the next year or two, for intercity transportation also it will be addressed. In case of charging infra, we have the depots where the charging infra is set up, so that's not a challenge. And we have terminals where it can be set up, so there's a dedicated space where it is available, where we do not have as much challenge with respect to asset utilization also, which is a key aspect for total cost of ownership, because the buses have a dedicated route on which they operate, and the way they work. And clearly, one can see that as we go forward, that nothing is fixed, things will be fast evolving. But this is my view, how I see in each of the domains, but I'll be focusing particularly on e-buses. But that's why we understand that today, electric buses are not a necessity, is a necessity, it's not an option. And that where we have to see how we are giving a comfortable, safe, and green environment, so that people are really seeing that how it's a mode of choice rather than a compulsion in such scenarios. So this is something which has to be understood, and this is a transition all of us are going through. Looking at the GCC, which is a gross cost contract model, because we're talking about business models. So today we see that different STUs, municipal corporations or corporates are getting the subsidy from the government, and then those organizations enter into gross cost contracts with mobility solution providers, and they are paid on per kilometer basis. And definitely the subsidy is also given to them, and then they end up giving performance guarantees, bank guarantees, and the OEMs sell their vehicles and the charging infrastructure and other things to these mobility solution companies, because OEMs in certain cases are also acting as mobility solution providers, and in certain cases are acting as pure OEMs, depending on case to case basis. So because in this case, holistically we are able to address all aspects of it. If you see clearly, the central government or the state government gives a subsidy, then the municipal corporation is also ensuring the parking space, the depots, they are collecting all the revenues, they are bearing the charging costs which are being provided, and the power line and the power infrastructure is being provided for by them. Similarly, the mobility solution provider has fixed routes, they have the drivers who are trained to drive electric buses, which is definitely something one has to ensure from day one, because the way you drive diesel or CNG buses is different from how you use electric buses, and that is critical in defining the performance of these vehicles as well, maintaining these vehicles. And they have to develop the charging infrastructure as a mobility solution provider. So it's a complete EV ecosystem which has to be put in place. And here we see these four key stakeholders who are not the only stakeholders but the primary stakeholders in this scenario, basis which the whole business model operates. Then when we go to GCC model, so there are different kinds of risks which have to be seen, which have to be addressed. So whether we talk about the time and cost overruns in different cases, because there are back-to-back agreements which any mobility company would have with OEMs for deliveries. There are undertakings which they give for these cases, because many mobility companies are not very big in size, and the promoters themselves are involved in running many of these electric mobility companies here, so they don't have very high bandwidth, so they just are on the edge at times how they are able to work and operate and move forward. Then clearly the kind of funding which is available for such kind of projects, what is the profile of the city, what is the credit profile of the special purpose vehicles, and the kind of technology they are using is also a question, because these are all new developments which the financial institutions are not used to seeing. And what kind of agreements are there with different suppliers, with different component manufacturers, replacements, what kind of battery life is going to be there, what kind of reserve has to be put in place. These are all concerns which are getting addressed as we go along, and different kind of counterparty risks, that if it's a very high investments in electric buses, definitely the capex is set off in a big way by the operating cost in this scenario, and that's why the gross cost model works well. So what kind of payment mechanisms are there, counterparty risks, how does the state have its fund for the STU for supporting with the viability gap funding, what kind of fixed contracts they are going to work with OEMs, because many of the operators do not understand this technology very well, it will still take some time to mature. How would they work, what kind of agreements are there with the OEMs on bus performance parameters, efficiency, spare parts. So I think all these things are very important. I'm just putting across certain key areas which need to be addressed in every city, which I feel that are being looked at very comprehensively now as we move forward. And whether we see now CESL or DHI or different STUs in states, in last 2, 3, 4 years, we've come a long way from FAME 1 to FAME 2, and now with the extension of FAME 2 until FY24. So these 3 years again will be very crucial in redefining this market. When we talk about total cost of ownership, so we see that fixed costs, operational costs, variable costs, they play a very important role. In the TCO model, we see that how per kilometer usage is there as we see. So other than the aspects which I touched upon there, here I'm talking primarily with respect to the vehicle, how lightweighting is so essential, how powertrain configuration is so important in this case, that it has to be very optimal. You are not oversizing or undersizing it. At the same time, multiple system efficiencies do come in with the electric buses, because there is no conversion required. Everything can be taken up straightforward. A lot of parasitic losses can be taken out. And definitely we as an organization always feel that road load data acquisition or route mapping becomes very important, because there is not one for all kind of a solution. It has to be a comprehensive solution, but it has to be a customized solution for every customer in every area. And that is how you improve the value proposition, which gives the city an edge to perform and to use those vehicles for its requirements and day-to-day consumers. And that is what leads to consumers using this as a vehicle of choice. Now, talking about different kinds of cost optimization, as we see, if we talk about, I'm just taking an example of 12-meter buses, the 12-meter buses which we see in Delhi or in Bangalore and other buses, taking an example of ex-showroom buses of diesel or CNG, and now electric buses here, depending on case to case, because there's no standard electric bus model which is there. One is 12-meter and 9-meter, the 12-meter pre-subsidy and post-subsidy buses here. So kind of fuel economy which we see in this case. So it goes to 2.5 to 3.5 kilometers per liter, then 2 to 3 kilometers per kg in CNG. But in electric, we talk about 0.85 to 1.4 kilometers per kilowatt hour. There's a typo here. So, and on the fuel price, if we compare, see, this is a huge difference. We talk about 100 rupees per liter in fuel price today, as we see, and 45 rupees per kg and 5. So eventually, if you see the TCO, it is 30 rupees per kilometer for fuel, 14 to 23 rupees in CNG buses, and 5 to 8.5. So that's a huge difference. And that is where we see that people have to operate with different kind of models. And clearly, electric bus has a OPEX benefit from day one. But then the electric bus technology roadmap, how we see this kind of roadmap, because this is again a driving factor for optimizing the costs and for moving forward. So then we talk about the drive architecture, what kind of motors we use, axles we are using, how we are reducing the parasitic losses, which I was referring to earlier, permanent magnet systems, ASM motors, what kind of IGBTs are there in place, then size of motors, range for the vehicles, battery capacities, battery chemistries. I think these are very important elements. And as the industry progresses, these things would improve substantially by leaps and bounds. Then talking about what we have been able to do, just giving you a quick glimpse, our model is to look at the whole ecosystem, not only as a bus company, but how we focus on key aggregates, power transmission, charging infrastructure, artificial intelligence, how we are using to get real-time data, and operation maintenance to look at the whole e-mobility ecosystem. So we do multiple kind of products in 12-meter, 9-meter, and few other vehicles. And we believe as a company that we are committed to about 1 billion kilometers in the next 3 years, which will knock off about 1 billion kgs of CO2 from the environment. So that is our pledge as an organization. These are our vehicles which we have deployed, which are running for the last 2 years in Navi Mumbai, in FAME 1, and now we have a large number of buses in FAME 2 as well, in Navi Mumbai as well. So I think, but an end-to-end perspective, how it is so important to get a clear view, and remote monitoring and diagnostics is so important in this scenario. Similarly, in Port Blair, we have our electric buses. In Ahmedabad, our buses have been deployed very well. So our value, what is our value proposition? What do we see? I think an end-to-end approach from feasibility, technology selection, power infrastructure, charging infra, and operation and maintenance for 10 years. That is the front end. But at the back end, we see that how sustainable business models with TCO are developed, proper due diligence is done for every location, how we work with STUs or corporations or the state on charging infra, on route planning, capacity building, stakeholder engagement, scheduling and operations. I think that is very important, and that is the real food for thought to see how different mobility companies are not just acting as operators, but there's an early involvement of different players for really utmost integration and no gaps to be there in place. So for that, whether we look at the EV charging ecosystems, the vehicle stations, OEMs, we see that there are few gaps in different cases. So all those need to be looked at, and how we are working to see that grid stabilization is also being taken up, grid monitoring, energy generation, and management of the whole fleet is being taken up basis that. So looking at different kinds of solutions in manufacturing, in software and charging, I think that is the critical path in this case. Looking at a well-to-wheel concept, our view is always that how we are seeing that end-to-end from generation to consumption, everything is green. So how we are generating power from renewable sources, we are using different renewable sources, because the power you generate in a depot, even if you put solar photovoltaic panels, is not enough. So then you use other powers through net metering, energy storage systems, and how a depot is self-sufficient in as many ways as possible, how auxiliary power is used. So this is our view, and this is how we look at it, and that is the reason why our organization has been awarded as one of the best manufacturers, ecosystem providers in different domains, and that is what we would like to share. And now coming to our philosophy of think global, act local, I think this is something which is very important, because this is going to be the game changer as we proceed further. So, which is going to be very essential in the industry and in this scenario now. So that is my perspective, and that is how I look at it. And now for the city of Bangalore, we have geared up completely, and shortly you will be seeing our complete EV ecosystem being deployed in Bangalore as well in the next couple of months. And definitely our idea is how we are able to ensure a self-reliant and Atmanirbhar ecosystem in India, where make in India and making for the world is very, very important. And our focus is very clearly on how technology is driving value. So in all our initiatives, we are clearly seeing that how indigenous technology is being developed, and how technology is enabling end consumer to have utmost level of comfort, safety in a green environment. Thank you. If you have any questions, I would be happy to address them as planned.
Hello. Thank you so much, Nishant, for that wonderful presentation. And as rightly said, future mobility has to be energy efficient. While we are looking at the right optimal business model, we have to anyways move forward in this regard and find the right ecosystem, build the right ecosystem to make it happen. And thank you for sharing the details about the initiatives you have taken and the rollouts you have done in different parts of India, and also sharing about the GCC analysis model that JBM has undertaken. So with that, I don't know if we can take the questions now. We will, if you're okay, we will keep it to the end, and we will move to our next presenter, Ms. Prabjot, who's also joined us online. Ms. Prabjot Kaur, co-founder, Esmito Solutions. So over to you, Prabjot, and request you to please give a brief about yourself and your organization. And we have, I think, 10 minutes for this presentation. So I request you to please take over. Thank you.
Thanks, Reena. And yes, I'll try to be as precise and still would want to convey the point I'm here for. And would stick to the topic, that's battery swapping, and that's what it's meant for: quick, smart, and fast. So we'll come to that. But first of all, as Reena wanted that I should introduce myself. I'm founder and CEO for Esmito Solutions Private Limited, and we are into management of EV infrastructure. We do our own batteries, swap stations, and the platform and the apps around it. So entirely our system is into making India's transport more, I would say, more affordable, yet more advanced and more efficient as far as technology is concerned. And the whole of the effort that we have been putting in for last about 5 years in association with the Center for Battery Engineering at IIT Madras earlier, and then for last 3 years in our company, has been to make every system in India indigenously. Everything done from scratch, right in the country, right in our campus, and now in the company. So we are we have already started manufacturing, and we are scaling up the business. With that, we've come to the topic, that's battery swapping, and what I chose was that for within this 10 minutes, be as sharp as possible to convey what are the technological challenges that we have in the battery swapping, and how do we reduce, or what are the things that we need to do to see that those challenges are overcome. So before that, just to cover the issues very broadly, what we have in the entire ecosystem in the country, and what we are focusing right now from the company's point of view, or also from India's point of view, that we say for the electric mobility or for transportation, where we have almost 85-90% of the mix in two-wheelers and three-wheelers. So that's the major segment that we are focusing on. And in that segment, when we talk about bringing in electric mobility, the affordability plays a very, very important role. And since all these speakers since morning would have been talking about affordability and the issues and bringing the economic viability of these business models in the country, we know that almost 40 to 50% of the cost in the vehicle is of batteries. And also batteries, not only the cost, but also a threat that people have inside for driving an electric vehicle lies with the battery, both because of the performance as well as for the safety. So if there is somebody who owns this piece, that is, if, for example, we in Esmito say that, hey, you buy the battery, buy the vehicle without the battery, your upfront cost is out. And then we take the whole ownership, that we provide you the fuel at a lesser price as compared to the ICE that currently you pay as diesel and petrol. Then the viability comes in picture. And we take the whole ownership, that we'll provide you the promised mileage, that is the range to be delivered per charge. And to enable this whole of the things technologically, in the entire piece, what we have, there are 2-3 systems that we talk about. The very first piece is the battery. Second piece is the swap station. Third piece is the whole software model that we have to talk about. And the fourth thing that actually brings all these things together is the entire consolidation of these technical pieces into the business model. That means weaving them all together in a way that these no longer remain the technology per se, but together with this can be launched and becomes fruitful for the people who have to enjoy the fruit of this technology that we are wanting to do in-house. So if we talk about the first component, that is battery, again, 2-3 threads that we have in the battery. One, when we are offering the battery as swapping, as a piece that we own and it is there with the people, the biggest threat is of the theft. In India, I mean, when you are given a device and you know that you are not to pay for it, the natural tendency in many of the people that we fear for is that once you give the device, it is not going to come back. So it is a threat. So can technology solve such threats? The answer is yes. So what we have done is we make our battery smart in a way that these batteries can be charged only with our own chargers, that is our own swap stations. And this battery can be given as an option that it will be discharged only for the vehicles it is meant to discharge. So there are encryption techniques that one could follow to overcome this threat. That is one of the ways to overcome this threat of the theft. The second part is the performance in itself. The chemistries are changing very fast. Their performances are unknown. As soon as the batteries or the chemistries we hear that every 6 months we hear about a new chemistry, newer form factor, we also hear about the increasing energy densities. And without that, those have been thoroughly tested, and that we have the results for about 5-7 years, which is actually not possible in the competitive market that we are residing in. So what we have as a product which is not very well tested already. So what we tend to get is something that is not very well tested, and hence we cannot rely on it. So the performance in itself is a big question mark. The third threat that we have on the battery is that, okay, I buy today a battery which is about, let's say, 2 kilowatt in 10 kgs, or say 15 kgs, it is giving me a 2 kilowatt hour capacity. Now, a year later, the same size, same cost, same dimensions would give me maybe about 2.5 kilowatt hour or maybe higher. So nobody at that point in time would want to restrict itself to an older version of it. So we would all keep on waiting for the newer versions to come. Now, that's where the swapping becomes, plays beautifully. So because here, if we are into the model of the swapping, or anyone out of us in the audience is into the swapping, then we as an operator, we are actually doing the cycling or the aging of the batteries faster as a normal person would do. So we would end up consuming the batteries faster than the other people or retailers would actually do. So we have a good chance that we can upgrade the system first. The second thing is that performance needs to be monitored. So technically what you need to have is that we keep on having the batteries where we can not only monitor the overall battery capacity, but go to the cell level. Till the cell level, that we are able to figure out what is happening inside the cell. Can I identify what is the age left? I have certain algorithms which predict very accurately, matching the international standards, saying that yes, at this point in time, this is the capacity or this is the life left in the battery. So using such algorithms or such techniques, you can make the business more viable at the same time, while we are targeting more business out of it. And we both go hand in hand, and that's where we see that without technology now, the business is actually not sustainable. And that's where we also see that India needs to have its own business, its own technology developed in-house. And without that, we cannot actually really scale or see that our EVs are going to be the future in the country unless we have our own systems developed. Now, the second subsystem in the whole ecosystem is the swap station in itself. Now we see lately that we have a couple of companies talking about swap stations brought down from China, and again just like the vending machines. But here what we require is that these swap stations talk to the batteries. They understand what batteries are. They do know that this is the type of the battery, and based upon this type of the battery, this is how I need to charge the battery. Because after all, your business is in your ability to extend the life of the battery. So if we are not able to extend the life of the battery, we are gone. And how do we understand or do the extensions or apply our own algorithms to extend the life of the battery? Is only when we understand, only when my charger or my swap station understands that this is how I should charge the battery, and this is the history of the battery. So what we require is a station which is connected to the cloud, which has the access, a very seamless access for or an ease of operation or a good GUI for the user who is not aware of what is happening in the back end, what is technology all about, etc., etc. Because for the users, like our cell phones, we don't know or we don't want to know what is running behind it. So for the users, it has to be safe and just seamless. But behind the picture, there's a lot of tech, lot of effort that needs to go to make that user experience a good experience to have and kind to scale. So that is one, that the swap stations need to be cloud connected. They need to understand the batteries. They need to maintain or enhance the life of the battery to the extent possible. Now, though we have been working on this for a long time, but as I also say that chemistries are always evolving, and we also see that these would be the trend going forward. We would have maybe batteries in the country 5 years down the line where we are not using lithium ion at all. The lithium material is all obsolete. I hope that happens, and that would be a big breakthrough in the country if that happens. Now, apart from that, if we talk about it, is the third thing that we want to do is that if we have, let's say, hundreds of swap stations in the country, the users should be able to figure out that where should I go, which swap station would give me a battery which is charged and it is mapped to my vehicle, which is kind of compatible to my vehicle. So I don't want to keep on searching the swap stations. So simple analytics, simple matching of the infrastructure to the user is what we require. And at any given time, that over the head, we can figure out that there are some malfunctions in the swap stations, there are malfunctions in the rectifiers. How do we identify that? And can we do some certain things that where the manual intervention is as low, as minimal as is possible. So those are some of the technical stuff that need to be done to make the business more viable, to make the business more attractive. So that's where, again, in this subsystem also, both go hand in hand, and we cannot avoid that. The third thing that we talked about, that I talked about, or the main component that we have, is the whole software piece and the analytics associated with that. So if we talk about the entire software piece, wherein if you or I are an operator, we own our asset, we own the swap stations, we are offering the services to the provider, and we have thousands of batteries which are actually rolled out in every city. Now, as an operator, you would also want to understand that how many batteries have been used, and out of whatever batteries you have rolled out, what is the status or what is the capacity left, what is the age left in which battery, what is the right time that you should actually replace the battery, or the right thing that you can recycle or you can send it for any other application. So at any time, if you are an operator and you can figure it out nicely, you have a better ROIs to your infrastructure. So here the software integration and analytics play a very, very important and a crucial role, which needs to be in place from the day one when we are talking about these kinds of services. Otherwise, this again is a kill to the business. The fourth and the last piece that I was talking about is a consolidation. For all these batteries or the three systems that we talk about, how do we bundle it together and offer it to the people? So in the beginning, Reena was talking about that the batteries could be leased or these could be offered for swapping. So when we talk about any of this that is lease or swapping, unless we monitor the batteries, because here again, this is a very, very capital intensive business. So here you would want that any and every asset that is going out in the field, you should be able to monitor it at any given point in time. So before we offer it as a lease model or a swappable model, the monitoring becomes the prerequisite for the battery. And at any given time, there are, some interesting models that are coming up. For example, if the customer doesn't pay or he doesn't come back, what do you do remotely? So the simple stuff that we do is that we disable the battery remotely. We tell the battery that, okay, from now onwards, you don't have to be discharged. So it's very similar to the concepts that we have in our mobile phones. We have our postpaid, prepaid connections. Once we don't pay for the connections or for the bills, our services are disconnected. So it's similar thing. The difference here being, here because
Prabjot, I would like to request you to close the next 2 minutes we have.
Yes. This is the last statement only, Reena. Yep. So this is what we have to offer, and this is where I see that the technology play a very important role in rolling out a successful business plan, and this whole of this ecosystem being a necessity, and that too in a country where there are variety of income levels, variety of segments in the vehicles itself, automobile demands and requirements varying. I think it's an important thing to address the two-wheeler, three-wheelers market and address the key affordability issue that we have in the country, while at the same time that we have good technologies to cater to the safety and the performance requirements of this segment, because without that, this is not going to be successful. So that is all from my side. I'll be happy to take the questions if any.
Thank you so much, and a big round of applause for Prabjot, and thank you for joining us online today, and sharing your insights about the battery swapping, the technologies that will help us enable the foolproof battery swap system for EVs. And we also heard an announcement about Bangalore to get 100 battery swapping stations for EVs by end of 2020 by Sun Mobility, that was announced. And definitely this will also give the EV users big relief on the range anxiety that we all have while we are looking forward to purchasing or going for electric vehicles. But as Prabjot mentioned, there are a lot of different things like analytics, etc. We have to look into account, and the challenges that may be there in the deployment and usage of it, that all have to be taken into account. But definitely this is one of the business models we are really looking forward to being in place. So with that, Prabjot, we'd like to have you with us till the end so that we can take up the questions from the audience later and move on to our next presenter, panelist, Mr. BC Datta. He's the Vice President, Ola Mobility. He's not online right now? Okay. So we will now move on with our next panelist. We have Mr. N. Mohan from with us on the dais, and Mr. Mohan is the head EVCI Convergence Energy Services Limited. Mr. Mohan heads the electric vehicle charging infrastructure department at Convergence Energy Services Limited, a wholly owned subsidiary of ESL, which itself is an entity under the Ministry of Power. And many congratulations to you and BESCOM for the MOU which has been signed today in the morning. So over to you, Mr. Mohan, and would like to hear more about what Convergence, what are the plans of Convergence in bringing the different business models for electric two-wheelers, three-wheelers, and electric buses in place. Over to you.
Thank you, ma'am. Good afternoon, everyone. So I know it's a hard time to sit after lunch, but I'll try to keep my presentation brief. I know the hard time sitting after lunch. So I'll try to cover
Sorry, I would like to just mention that we have about 60 participants attending online as well.
Okay.
So we have good audience there. Thank you.
Great, ma'am. So I'll be covering on what's the concept behind the electric mobility in India. So what are the key business model that CSL is following for building up electric two-wheelers, three-wheelers, and electric buses. A quick introduction on of e-mobility business. As you know, the government of India is leading the e-mobility, and there's a strong government policy push which is enabling the e-mobility in the country. Under the FAME2 scheme, there is a budget outlay of 10,000 crores. Along with it, almost 18 states and union territories have come out with their EV policies, and I compliment government of Karnataka, they being the first state to come out with the comprehensive EV policy and batteries. So each state under the EV policy, they have an aggressive target for EV deployment. Further, there are also regulations by Ministry of Power, DHI, where are building up standards for the charging stations. As you could see, although our penetration of electric vehicles are less than 1%, 1.3% to be very precise, but still we are seeing a good momentum in the country, and gradually post-COVID also, we are getting good numbers. Like last year, we sold around 1.3 lakhs electric vehicles in the country, and if you look at 2021, 21-22, almost we are touching close to 1 lakh near about electric vehicles. There was a recent Gazette notification amendment by DHI. So there the three major decisions were taken. First, there was a hike in the demand incentive for electric two-wheelers. So earlier it was 10,000 rupees per kilowatt hour. It was hiked to 15,000 rupees per kilowatt hour of the battery capacity, and capped to 40% of cost of the vehicle. In three-wheelers and electric buses, the CSL has been given a mandate to aggregate demand for 3 lakh three-wheelers in the country for multiple user segment. In the electric buses also, we have been given the demand given the mandate to aggregate demand in 9 cities, which are the 4 million plus population cities for e-buses under the scheme of OPEX basis. These are the 9 cities where we'll be aggregating the demand for electric buses in the country. Quickly about CESL, those who don't know about the company, CESL is Convergence Energy Services Limited. It's a 100% owned subsidiary of Energy Efficiency Services Limited. It's a JV company of 4 PSUs under Ministry of Power Government of India. So far in the electric mobility business, we have deployed more than 1,800 electric cars. And these cars have covered more than 50 million kilometers, around 5 crore kilometers have been covered. So we built up more than 1,600 charging stations, and of which 370 are the public EV charging stations. We have the mandate for implementing the FAME2 scheme, especially in the electric three-wheelers and the electric bus segment. We are working in the electric mobility industry. We're trying to build up the scalable business model for electric two-wheelers, three-wheelers, and electric buses across India. This is just to explain like why we need a business model for different electric vehicle segments. So there is no common solution for all the vehicle segment. Each vehicle segment will cater to different user requirements. So we're trying to see the electric two-wheelers. So probably like there's a big business case for B2C kind of segment, where at least we need a demand aggregation to create initial demand in the country. In the three-wheelers, we see there's a strong demand which would come up from the B2B business. And there's a strong need to have a structured financing model and financing options for mobility to grow. In the four-wheelers, it's more like in G2G business segment, which we're trying to call it as institution-to-institution engagement, where the initial demand is very good. And through this, we are deploying the electric cars through the lease model, which we call dry lease and the wet lease model. Under dry lease, it's basically like we're providing the electric vehicles without drivers, and wet lease where we are providing the driver services. In the electric buses, although we know like the FAME2, there's a strong mandate for electric buses, but there are certain inherent challenges which is causing a little delay in deployment of these electric buses by the state transport units. So we're trying to see like how these issues or gaps could be studied and addressed, and probably we could come out with a comprehensive bankable solutions, which is like suitable to each and every stakeholders. This is about the electric two-wheeler business model. Here we are trying to work in two different segments. One is we are trying to aggregate demand at the state level, where we're trying to see like if we can create demand for electric vehicles for state government officials. Second is we're trying to give out these electric vehicles to the retail consumers. So broadly here, we're not trying to do the procurement of electric two-wheelers. Here we're trying to empanel the OEMs. The process here is we empanel the EV OEMs through this EOI process, where the OEMs will list their electric vehicle model along with the prices. So we'll be creating a digital platform where at least a consumer can log in and can see like which are the type of electric vehicles which is available in the market, what's their specification, what the battery chemistry, what are the pricing for these vehicles. And also we're trying to work with multiple financing institutions to create a financing for these electric two-wheelers. Although we know there is an incremental cost one has to pay for acquiring the electric two-wheelers, but with the blended central subsidy and the state subsidy, the price gap is getting lowered now day by day. And we have seen there is a price parity which is going to achieve with respect to IC and the electric two-wheelers very soon. So why we're enabling the financing option is also through this digital platform. So at least the consumers can have an informed choice. You could look at purchasing these electric vehicles either through an outright purchase, which is a discounted price as compared to the regular retail price, or else you can go for an financing solution through the NBFCs. So here we are trying to see like there is an extended support for electric two-wheelers with respect to post-sales and service support also. This is a CRISPR-4 business model which we are working in 3 states presently, AP, Andhra Pradesh, Kerala, and Goa. So we are working with the State Nodal Agency there. There, the State Nodal Agency are aggregating the demand across multiple institutions. ESL, through the empowerment process, we are trying to list the OEMs in the digital platform. And here the customers will have choice to at least opt for the required electric vehicles, and they can finalize the financing options too. So these are the various steps we try to brief in, like where a demand would be entered at the state level. So three-wheelers, I think the use cases are entirely different as compared to the two-wheelers segment. In the three-wheeler segment, we're trying to have different use cases. Like primarily, we're trying to have the four use cases here. One is the last mile, the public transport. The second is the last mile, the goods transport, the garbage collection, and the LPG distribution or the loaders. So here also we try to explore the option of empanelment, but off late we realize like even if we do the empanelment, so probably the industry may not be very keen, or even the institutional clients may not be very keen to go for such an outright option. So here we have released a procurement tender for 100,000 electric three-wheelers, where CSL will be buying these electric three-wheelers, then we'll be financing these three-wheelers, and these three-wheelers would be given to the institutions on an lease plan. So our target is to deploy at least 100,000 electric three-wheelers in next 12 months' time. This is similar to the two-wheeler business model, but here we are trying to do an B2B kind of client arrangement. So here the major demand would come from the institutional or the e-commerce companies who are into like last mile deliveries and last mile services. So we see like if we can tap these big markets, so deployment of 100,000 three-wheelers could be done in a much faster time. So presently the financing is one of the limitation in the electric mobility segment. So we're trying to see like how probably we can enhance the funding options to the companies to acquire electric three-wheelers for their requirements. So I'll touch upon the electric buses here. We know like although the FAME 2 there is an there is an importance being given for the electric buses. So all 9 cities have been targeted for deployment of electric buses in the country. And here we did an assessment to estimate like how many electric vehicles could be deployed. Here the rationally what we try to adopt is we try to see like how many buses are there, existing buses fleets are there, which are overage, in the means like which have crossed more than say 15 to 20 years of time. We got a clear overage vehicle percentage, and the majority are in Chennai, followed by Bangalore, Delhi, and Calcutta. By assessing this, we estimate that easily like we could deploy close to 4,726 electric buses in these 9 cities. This is a cost comparison one who is trying to understand like how these electric buses would make more sense for the industry. Here we're trying to compare total cost of ownership of electric buses. When we blend the central subsidy, which is currently allowed under the FAME 2 scheme, and if a complementing subsidy could be made available by the state government. Here then the central subsidy of the FAME 2 scheme, we have in financial incentives of around 20,000 rupees per kilowatt of battery capacity. Here we assumed an scenario where the state would provide 10,000 rupees per kilowatt hour of battery capacity as a state subsidy. So once we had a subsidy from blended subsidy from the central and the state subsidy, then possibly I think the total cost of ownership of electric buses is almost comparable to the diesel buses. Definitely, we agree with the industry that the electric buses are the low operational cost and the fuel cost makes the e-bus highly competitive. So apart from this, we also trying to analyze like how probably we can increase the business around these electric buses. So a lot of opportunity lies when we go for a digital marketing within the electric buses that could generate additional revenue for operating the electric buses. And also we could look at how probably these charging infrastructure, which is a bigger bottleneck for industry as of now. So if you can look at standardizing some of this charging requirement for the e-buses, that could minimize the huge investment which presently the industry carries. So probably that could go as a separate charging as a service need for the electric buses too. So what plans we have is we plan to roll out a grand challenge concept by CESL. We try to have the 4 major broad contours here. The first step is like understanding the requirement, because as of now, the most of the STUs, when we consult with the OEMs, STUs and the financial institutions, there's a complete disparity with respect to understanding of the specification and the requirements. So we're doing this to understand like what the institution's key priorities are and what's the learning from the past experience. The second step is to create a clear demand. So probably like we want to create an model which is like more bankable. So probably we could look at the financing options from the external financing institution too. So once the step 1, step 2 are complete, we're going to have an grand challenge proposals from the STUs, where we seek proposal from the STU, where STUs will see like this is the number of electric buses they would like to have from CESL. Then subsequently, we intend to float an international competitive bidding for the procurement of electric buses. And also we try to see like there's a standardized agreement template across different stakeholders. So some of the key benefits which we foresee through the grand challenge concept, definitely I think CSL would become an access for the FAME2 incentives. And also we try to see there is a larger participation from domestic and international forums. The second, the aggregation is the key, where we are trying to minimize some of the issues which currently industry faces with respect to standardizing the contracting structures. Presently, like most of the STUs having different contracting structures which are customized as per their requirement. We understand there is a large gap in understanding with respect to contracting structures, which we want to standardize so we can adequately share the risk amongst the different stakeholders. Through the aggregation, we are confident of getting a lower price by more than 10 to 15%. Certain innovations could also be done here. So where probably I think the bus procurement and the charging infra procurement could be separated, and where the charging companies could come for providing a charging as a service to the electric buses too. So we're trying to engage multiple stakeholders for ensuring these projects have a bankability, and so at least the financing becomes easier for electric buses. So alternatively, since like these the electric buses falls under the clean mobility initiatives, we are trying to work with some of the bilateral green fund partners, and also we're trying to work how probably we can monetize some of the benefits which are allowed under the air quality initiatives. So definitely the carbon credits would be an additional advantage. So a lot of like alternate funding could also be thought once we have clarity with respect to aggregation and coming out with a grand challenge concept. So these are some of the key considerations which we thought the industry would look for having a larger participation. Definitely the bankability of demand has to be there. We see, I think the state government through a state guarantee could be one of the key where we probably, I think we can get a cost reduction. The performance guarantee and the reducing bank guarantee has to be there in the contracting structures. There has to be a predefined service level agreements and payment terms. So the bidders or the company or the bus operators, so they have a clarity with respect to like the roles and responsibilities. So we're trying to see for across all these 9 cities, there is an harmonized contractual terms. And further with respect to standardization of demand, we're trying to see from the STUs. So if they can at least standardize the route plan for the requirements, the technical specification with respect to the bus size, it's in like AC, non-AC bus, the battery capacity, the range requirements could be standardized to an extent. And also some of the depot requirements for electric buses could also be identified with respect to like one depot could be potentially can park 100 electric buses. So there's a good business case for the bus operators to operate these electric bus as per the requirement. So these are some of the key considerations which will be floating in the grand challenge, which is planned to release by November or early before November this year. So we're also trying to see, many times we see some of the government contracting has a lack with respect to monitoring and disputes. We're trying to see like there's a clear monitoring with respect to the bus performance, and also there's a clear dispute arrangement mechanism could also be structured in the transaction. So this is about a small, the glimpse of our EV charging plaza, which we have built up in Delhi. So this is why I'm showing this images. This is one of the,
Sorry.
yeah, this one, last slide, sorry, last slide. instead of charging plaza in Delhi, here just trying to see like how probably we could look at increasing the utilization of the charging stations. So earlier we thought of like utilizing or design these stations for the four-wheelers segment, but gradually we see since we need to cater to the larger battery electric vehicles, we made the same stations compatible for electric buses. So this is one of the way probably we could look at increasing the utilization of the existing charging stations. So we're happy that we have crossed more than 7 lakh units have been sold, and we have completed more than 1.2 lakh of charging sessions. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for patience hearing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mohan, for joining us today and for a wonderful presentation on the CSL's work on scalable business models that you're doing to deploy the three-wheelers and two-wheelers and the e-buses, and also the grand challenge that you are going to come up with. So thank you. And with that, we have our last panelist to present Mr. Swapnil. Mr. Swapnil Jain, the co-founder of Arthur Energy. Can we have his introduction slide, please? And you have a PPT, Swapnil? You've given all. Put his PPT also. So over to you, Swapnil, to just give a brief introduction about yourself and before they put the presentation in place.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you and good afternoon, everyone, for this opportunity. And so just a quick brief. I'm co-founder of Arthur Energy. We are a startup where we have been a startup. We started in 2013 from IIT Madras. It was just two of us who decided one fine day that electric, like the vehicles are gonna turn electric soon. It was very evident that the technology was sort of evolving very rapidly, and we are gonna reach a point where electric vehicles will start making a lot of sense. What we also realized is that the vehicles which are already there in the market were not something which was very interesting for most customers. They targeted a certain segment which would be interesting, but was not something which a major population would consider as their primary two-wheeler. And this is back in 2012 when electric vehicles weren't really as cool as they are right now. So, but we sort of could foresee that electric vehicles are going to be the future. And what was important for us was that the vehicles we cannot sell electric vehicles just because they are going to save the environment or because they're going to be like sort of dear on the pocket. At that point of time, all these subsidies were not really there. There were some subsidies, but it was not. It was primarily non-existent. It was very small, and at the same time, the petrol charges were not as they are. Probably at that point of time, it was some 70-75 rupees, or even lesser. So it was definitely we didn't start Ather with a thought process that we want to build a vehicle which will be either saving the environment, because we are very clear most people don't want to save the environment. Most people want to just go from point A to point B. That's all they care about. Very few people are altruistic enough to sort of want to save the environment. Most people are practical. They know that within their lifetime they want to live as happily as possible. So they would want to choose the best vehicle out there. So the only way to make a transition to electric vehicles was only if people really love the product. It doesn't matter whether it is saving the environment. It doesn't matter whether it is cheap or it is expensive. End of the day, you have to love the product which you are having. And automobiles in particular, people really love their vehicles. There is a very emotional bond with electric with the vehicles which you own. It's very important for people. For some it is the engineering behind it. For some it is a prestige point, which brand which you are owning. People people associate themselves with the brand of the vehicle they ride. And hence vehicles cannot be, more for the most part, are actually not very rational decisions. They are very emotional decision. And we were very clear that we want to sort of tackle that emotional decision. So let me go back. Okay. So with this, this is the brief journey of us. We started in 2013, two of us with a very audacious target that two college kids were going to build electric vehicle. We had no idea what it takes to build a vehicle, but we were really ambitious enough to sort of go on that journey. Thankfully, until now, we have been able to get good interest from investors. We have raised about 142 million in funding. Our portfolio right now is two different electric vehicles, two different variants of the vehicle, and a widespread charging infrastructure. We have a team set about 1,000 plus. We are present around 50 markets. We have started sort of sell. And in the last 3 years, we have had 4 different scooters out there. This is a slightly old data. We have touched 200 charging stations in the country just last week. We have about 17 experience centers. We again opened 2 in the last week, so it's touching about 20, and about 80 million kilometers ridden. Actually, that's also an old data. We have almost already crossed about 100 million kilometers on the road. So we started. Again, a brief timeline. We started in 2013. 2014 was the first fundraise. It took a long time because, as I said, there are 2 things going against us. One is that we are basically a really small company in a very big world of automobiles. At the same time, electric vehicles were very nascent. So a lot of the things which are very easily available right now, the ecosystem which has been already is sort of starting to grow up. In 2013, that ecosystem did not exist. So it took us almost 4.5 years. Ecosystem includes supplier ecosystem includes this customer awareness, and also includes the talent, right? Like hiring for electric vehicles in 2013 was not an easy target. So it took us almost about 5 years for us to build the entire ecosystem, build the product, go through a lot of failures, ensuring one thing was very clear in front of us, that if we are putting a product out there, it has to be a product which stands out. It is not going to be the best electric vehicle. It is going to be the best 2-wheeler in the market when we launch. And hence we took our sweet time, and in 2018 we sort of launched the first product. Again, took a sweet time to sort of ramp up the production, solve all the production issues, field issues, and ensure that as the product expands, all the field issues are taken care, and we don't have any major failure in the field as we start expanding. In 2020, we sort of went big bang. We expanded to 10 cities. We launched our second product, which was a 450X. It is the quickest scooter out there, 0 to 40 in 3.3 seconds. It is faster than most 125 and 150cc scooters out there in the market. And obviously, it doesn't cost much to run that scooter. So you get the thrill of of accelerating fast, but you don't get the guilt of spending a lot on the petrol. And we are in 2021. We have expanded. I've already described how much we have expanded. Looking at an expansion about 50 cities by end of this financial year. Right. So we have always taken an ecosystem approach to develop the product. We developed our vehicle, our charging infrastructure, and connectivity. So from day one, our vehicles have been connected. We have features like onboard navigation on the vehicle. We have a remote monitoring, remote diagnostics, over-the-air upgrades. These are something which are unthinkable even in 4-wheeler and even in 2-wheelers. It's the kind of advancement we have is been very different from what's been there in the market even today. So we have always taken an ecosystem approach to developing the product. Built a large R&D team. Every single piece of equipment on the vehicle was designed by our team in-house, made with the dashboard, battery, BMS, the entire frame. Everything was designed by our team in-house. We design and manufacture our own battery pack, our own battery management system, and the algorithms which run on the vehicle. So we have had a strong inclination toward developing the R&D for building the vehicle. So it's represented by the 300 plus engineering team, and obviously we have been committed to Make in India because for no other reason that if you have to really expand every single part, India has a great ecosystem, and we have to leverage that ecosystem to build the vehicles in the country. A brief of our patent portfolio: almost 44 patents filed, 10 granted, and a lot of international patents also on the way. This is our product portfolio today. 3 different variants in color. 450X is our flagship product. We have another product which is 450 plus. Again, the only vehicle with an all aluminum chassis. Everything has been built to ensure performance. Like the vehicle has to feel like, even though it's a scooter, it has to feel better than a motorcycle when it's on the road. The weight distribution, the stiffness of the chassis, everything has been designed to ensure you don't feel like you're riding a scooter, but you feel like you're riding a motorcycle, or even better. 0 to 40 in 3.3 seconds. Again, the quickest quickest scooter out there in the market, and 80 kmph top speed. Though people have touched almost about 90 as well. In-house production of battery, the design and manufacturing of the battery has been done in-house. An IP67 battery, which means that you don't have to worry about rains or flooding in any part of the country. A 2.9 kilowatt-hour battery pack and a certified range of about 118 kilometers. So the area range is actually 118, but we sort of claim a conservative range of 80 kilometers because in cities you end up getting a little lesser than what's the ARAI claimed range. The only scooter to have had a touchscreen dashboard and a 7-inch TFT dashboard until now. Which ensures we have a connectivity, we have onboard navigation, and we have things like remote diagnostics. Right, I spoke about this again. Things like Bluetooth. You have Google Maps. You can actually accept reject calls without even getting your hands off the vehicle. Charging infrastructure is something also we have very heavily invested in. Again, since the beginning of Ather, we have been designing various. We have a third architecture of charging infrastructure actually coming in with a focus on looking at how you can install. One of the things about two-wheelers is that you don't need a lot of power to fast charge a two-wheeler, unlike a four-wheeler. What it means that you can actually put up many charging stations because it doesn't cost a lot. It doesn't take a lot of space. And you can just flood the city with charging infrastructure. So that's been our journey, looking at various architecture, looking at various constraints on what if you want to put charging station in every cafe, in every eatery, and what does it mean to actually do that? What kind of architecture is better suited? Looking at the power availability, well, we might say that okay, it takes only 2.5 kilowatts to charge a vehicle, a two-wheeler. But in some places, even 2.5 kilowatts is not available. The only sanctioned capacity is like 5 kilowatts, and they're already using 4 kilowatts. So what do you do in those kind of situations? So actually putting up those sort of understanding the infrastructure, understanding the grid, understanding the constraints of various places of how to get the infrastructure, ensuring the charging infrastructure is also connected, which means that people are having a real-time update on which place they can go. So funnily, when I was coming here, I realized I was low on charge, and then I found a charging infrastructure nearby, and then just put my vehicle on charge there and came to talk here. So we have been expanding charging infrastructure quite heavily. We have also designed the charging the home charging, again ensuring a seamless charging and safe charging, especially in home. What you see there is what you see there is a dot charger, which is a home charger, which gives you a very convenient charging at home. Again, public charging, which I spoke about, which gives you a very fast charging, about 0 to 80 in less than an hour is what you can charge in any of the public charging infrastructure. We have been rapid expanding. Last week we finished installing 200 charging infrastructure across the city in various across the country in various cities. Again, we have an aggressive plan which hopefully will touch 500 by the end of this financial year. Right. So this is again a portable charger where you can charge anywhere. You don't even need you just need a 5 amp socket to charge. The entire ecosystem of charging, a portable charger, a home charger, a charging infrastructure, all of this along with the connectivity stack has been built by Ather. Again, we have taken a different approach towards our retail as well. It's not just because again, electric vehicles need a lot of education for the customers. It's a big shift from what you have been buying and what you have used to. You understand your petrol scooter in and out. You understand every penny you spend on it, where you spend in maintenance, what are the challenges with the vehicle, and it's almost relearning of what it means to have a electric vehicle which needs to go through. And hence, even though we are really pro digital, we realize that vehicle is not something you can really sell in a digital manner. There are a lot of questions which people have, and we have to ensure that people are making an informed decision when you're buying a vehicle. And hence, every city where we are selling, we have though our most of the process is online, we have a physical presence where you can go and get everything clarified about the vehicle. You understand everything in detail about the vehicle. And it's not, nobody's trying to sell you the vehicle. Everyone is just trying to get you educated about what the 450X and what it means to own an electric vehicle means. So redefined our experience.
Swapnil, sorry, just 1 minute.
Yeah, sure.
Give you because we have a hard stop after 10 minutes.
So the final thing is we have a hostel factory, which we have a single vehicle line, 2 battery line, and we're looking at about 1 lakh vehicles to be built per annum, and it's a continuously expansion plan. In short, our business model. Okay, a very quick thing that we won various awards. The biggest being a scooter of the year, car and bike scooter of the year award, which we won last year. So our business model has actually been a lot about experience, ensuring that the vehicle is really loved by the individual who's riding it. It doesn't matter whether it is cheap or expensive, whether it's electric or petrol. You have to just love the vehicle which you're riding, and that's been our focus all along. Hence, the design, experience, connectivity, everything has been the focus. Right.
So thank you so much. I'm so sorry to interrupt you in between, but we have a hard stop in 10 minutes. So thanks so much for sharing the details about the work you're doing towards building an ecosystem for sustainable business models, particularly in the two-wheeler space, and also for all your efforts towards Make in India and having the vehicle and charging infrastructure developed and designed in India, and the local supply chain that you have achieved more than almost 99% localization and in-house production of batteries that you're working towards. So thank you. And I think we have about 10 minutes before we close the session. So if any questions from the audience for any of our panelists. Bala? There's one mic there. Please introduce yourself and ask your question.
This is Madan. I have a question for him regarding, do you support retrofitting of three-wheeler and looking at financing the drivers for converting their existing vehicle into electric?
So there is no straight answer for this. So definitely, I think the industry is trying to look for retrofit also, definitely. But as of now, under the FAME policy, there is no clear guidelines like how probably they can incentivize the vehicles which are retrofitted from IC to the electric vehicles. But I think there's a longer vision I think one could look at, because like most of the vehicles which would be retiring, so probably would be eligible for the scrapping incentive also, which many states have announced. So in between, probably I think the blending some of the retrofit, which would be like the proven and approved by RTO, could make more economical sense. But I think still, I think the market is evolving, and there is a large market one could look at if they really are keen to build the retrofit solutions which would suit the existing the vehicle segment.
So if it is approved by ARI, if it is the drivers are happy, the vehicles performing well, and the volume of number of three-wheeler you're looking at, I think in a short time, you may not be able to get that much vehicle manufactured at this moment. So for a short time, maybe a year or two, can you look at supporting retrofitting? So the number of vehicles on the road can polluting vehicle can come down together and same time the non-polluting vehicle go up without increasing the number of vehicle on road?
No, definitely, yes, sir. There is definitely, yes. I think there is a clear look we could look at. So probably, I think if we have some solutions, companies who are doing this retrofit, I think we're open to at least assess their proposal. Definitely.
So
Thank you. Thank you for your question. And I have one question for you, Mr. Mohan, coming from our participant who have joined us online. They want to request us to check with you on your insights on demand side management implementation in Delhi. How about current implementation that if you can share EV charging station, a grid connected EV charging station implementation vis-a-vis demand side management implementation?
Okay. So if I understand the questions correctly, I think each state has a different supply code regulation. So in Delhi, like the LT connections are allowed up to 200 kilowatt. So it becomes one of the favorable factor for the charge point companies to build the higher capacity charging stations. But the one of the interesting concept here is like since in Delhi or many BESCOM, they have the information with respect to the existing load at the distribution transformer level. So the planning becomes much easier. So whenever we need to deploy a charging station at a location, at least we look at these the grid maps from the distribution utility and try to analyze what kind of spare load would be available at these locations, and accordingly we can map our charging station and we can build our charging stations. But right now, I think if it is more towards like analytics and the grid management structure, so presently there is a limitation because most of the communication is from the chargers to the vehicle. So the back-end communication from the chargers to the electric grid is not there. I think we are also trying to explore some of the analytics part around how probably we can link up with the existing grid management structure. Where the depending upon the load from the vehicles, so probably we could look at communicating with the utility load management, and accordingly probably either we can reduce the load or probably we can bring the load in the system.
Thank you, Mr. Mohan, for answering that question. I think we can take up one more question. The gentleman already has the mic, so I'll have to give him a chance.
Okay.
Please introduce yourself, sir.
I am Ajay Rao, and I work for a company called Gilbarco Veeder-Root. We are a global player in the fuel retailing space and kind of keen on EV infra as well. I have two questions. One is for Dr. Prabjot and one is for Mr. Mohan as well. Firstly, I'll go for Dr. Prabjot.
Let me just check. Ms. Prabjot, are you there? Can you please speak? Okay.
My question on battery swapping is, where are we in terms of interoperability? Is there a future for interoperability in battery swapping? Wanted to sort of understand that part.
Yes, in fact, thanks for asking the question, because that's one of the very big constraints that we have currently. Our vehicles, our batteries, our subsystems, our chargers, especially from communication and from connectors point of view, so far are not standardized for even the fixed charging infrastructure, so leave alone this swapping side of it. But as far as interoperability is concerned, there are good efforts that have been taken up by the Bureau of Indian Standard. Currently, I chair the committee there for the swapping standardization in the country. What I can tell on behalf of our panel, and actually a good initiative that Mr. Sajid and the group and there at BIS is taking up, is to actually bring in the interoperability for the swapping. So we have started with the low EVs, which is again the 2-wheelers and 3-wheeler segment. So a lot of work has happened on the standardization from the batteries point of view, from chargers and vehicles point of view, as far as their interfaces are concerned. Now, what we are leaving is that you can have any and every chemistry, but have better efficiency, and the dimensions are fixed, the connector is fixed, the communication is fixed. So the basic elements that are required to bring in interoperability, that's an effort that is going on.
Okay, thank you for that answer. One last question for Mr. Mohan. I wasn't a little clear. Does Convergence Energy, Are they having their own charging infra solution, or are you working with specifically? Because I wasn't clear of that model, what exactly was going on there.
So here in the charging business, like we own the asset. So we own the asset. Normally we do the bulk procurement of electric chargers through the open tendering process. Then we build these stations in partnership with the land partners. The land partners could be the distribution utility, the municipality, the metro corporation, development authorities, where we make the investment in the charging infrastructures and we take the entire responsibility for getting those the upstream utility infrastructure also for these stations. And we build and operate these stations for a period of say 10 years time.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for your question and thank you for your answer, Mr. Mohan. And thank you, Prabjot, for staying with us and answering that question. I think the last question of the day, and we have to keep it brief. So,
Sure, thank you. Hey, this is Vish with AutoGrid. Some of you might know. So Swapnil, I have to ask you a question about EV battery swapping. Obviously, you're a big OEM for car two-wheelers. Why have you chosen the route of not making a swappable battery? I mean, technically or product-wise, like, is it suboptimal? Is it standards? What's missing from that standpoint for your product decision?
Yeah, so I think from the perspective of like a consumer market, or from a consumer perspective, it is very it's not very lucrative to look at a battery swap. That's what we really believe, because if you look from a B2B market, then it really makes sense. Like if you are running fleet, you have to clock a lot of kilometers per day. It absolutely makes sense to like have battery swapping. But when you look from a consumer's point of view, most people will not actually cross more than 80, probably 100 kilometers is a real peak, right? Like 100 kilometers is maximum you would ride on a two-wheeler in one single day. And the easiest way to charge for you is to once you are back home, your vehicle is idle and it's just there. So you charge it overnight. Yes, there are certain early hiccups, I would say, which are related to again like the RWA is allowing for the charging to happen and charging points to be put up. I think these are definitely early hiccups, but as a product, imagine going to like okay, like typically your petrol, if you have to go to a petrol bunk, then it's still like you go it like, in once in a week or so, right? But if you're having 100 kilometers of range on your vehicle and you have to go probably, let's say, 50 kilometers per day, that means that you're going to a charging station every second day, right? And you're getting battery swapped every second day, which will actually become a hassle for you to own an electric vehicle, because now you have to visit like much more often the swap station or a petrol or the whatever the filling station, much more often than what you were doing with a petrol vehicle. Now imagine the number of charging stations you would need to actually make that, or the swap stations you would need to make that happen. So we think from a consumer perspective, it absolutely makes sense to have a home charging. But from a B2B perspective, it absolutely makes sense to have a battery swapping as a concept. I don't think both of them can have a single solution.
thank you so much. And I think that brings us to the end of this session, as well as today's workshop, Karnataka e-mobility workshop. Thank you once again to our esteemed panelists for joining us and sharing your insights and the variety of business models that you're working on, and trying to build the right ecosystem for making the future mobility possible in India. So thank you, and a big round of applause to all our panelists who are joined us in person as well as on WebEx. And thank you to all the delegates who patiently been with us till the end and listen to the experts talking. And also a special thanks to all our online participants who have been there since morning and have been part of this program. So thank you. And Mr. Philip, would you like to say anything, any concluding remarks? No, okay. So we close today, and thank you once again. And namaskara, and have a good evening. Bye-bye. Please take care.